hand over to our international keynote speaker. So I'll first just introduce Professor Geoff Fong. He's a university professor of psychology and public health sciences at the University of Waterloo and senior investigator at the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. He led the creation of the ITC project, and for over 20 years, the ITC project has conducted an international cohort survey of tobacco use in 31 countries, covering over half of the world's population. One important focus of the ITC project has been to evaluate and understand the impact of population-level interventions and to reduce tobacco use, notably among those of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control suite of measures. The ITC project teams have conducted many evaluation studies of FCTC policies, including pictorial warnings, smoke-free laws, tax price policies, tax bans, restrictions, support for cessation and illicit trade, among other policy domains. Geoff has been on many advisory boards, including those of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, Conference of the Parties, Health Canada, and other governments. And notably, he was an expert consultant for Australia in its defence of plain packaging at the World Trade Organization and for Uruguay in their successful defence of their packaging laws at a trade treaty challenge by Philip Morris International. He was recently selected by the FCTC Conference of the Parties to be part of the expert group for Article 2.1 on forward-looking tobacco control measures. And Geoff has received a number of recognitions for his work over the years, including a World Health Organization World No Tobacco Day Award, the Luther Terry Award, SRNT's John Slade Award, and the Canadian Governor-General's Innovation Award. And he's an Officer of the Order of Canada. So now I would like to welcome Geoff to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coral. It's wonderful to be here. And I have been so pleased to meet many people that I've only met on Zoom or Teams over the many years. And so it's really wonderful to meet you all in person. I wish we all had more time to talk. So let me see. Oh, here we are. So when I was thinking about what I would want to talk about with respect to International Endgame, I also knew that Coral was going to be talking about the international situation. So I thought, what can I do that touches upon some of the issues that she raised in her presentation, but also other things that you might not be aware of that are linked to the concept of Endgame. And so I thought, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and it occurred to me being here about how extraordinary it is that there is a new generation of researchers in this room and yesterday at SRNTO that are engaged in research on this critically important issue, not only for public health, but for human rights and for all the other kinds of key concepts and communities that are a part of our lives. And it occurred to me also that in most countries, that's not happening. And that here in Australia, and also in Korea, and also Taiwan, and other places that are represented in this room, there's a new generation of researchers that can carry on with respect to addressing the issue of commercial tobacco, and in general about human rights and all the other things that tobacco use and nicotine use touch. So I thought that what I would do is to kind of build that bridge. And first, let me just talk about my disclosures. I've got some research grants and other sorts of things, but the thing on the bottom is the important one. And I'm going to give you an outline. I'm going to go to touch upon the WHO Framework Convention and the need to do more. Talk very briefly, like Coral did, about incremental versus disruptive measures. And then now, what can we learn from past tobacco control successes to guide progress in the tobacco endgame? So that's, it all starts, at least for me, with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. As we know, it's the first ever WHO treaty. It's been ratified by 182 countries and also the European Union, so the 183 parties, 90% of the world's population. So you know those policies there, I don't have to go over them, but given the fact that combustible tobacco is the #1 preventable cause of death and disease. And the FCTC is aimed at addressing that problem and has 90% of the world's population. It really is, I think, a no-brainer that the FCTC is the greatest disease prevention in history. And it's been recognized by many global initiatives, including the NCD Action Plan from WHO, the SDGs themselves, and also the UN Development Program, all focusing on the importance of the FCTC to achieve their respective goals. And has the FCTC had an impact? Well, we've done a lot of work on this on the ITC project. We have evaluated many of the individual level policies, not individual level, individual policies across many different countries on warning labels, smoke-free laws, taxes, plain packaging, et cetera, et cetera. These are all demand reduction measures, but of course they have their limits, and I'll make that clear in a few minutes. I was on the expert group for the impact assessment of the FCTC a number of years ago, and we were charged with conducting the official evaluation of the impact of the FCTC in the treaty's first decade. So among the many things that we did for the expert group, we did an analysis in collaboration with WHO on examining on the x-axis the change in the number of high-level implementations of the key demand reduction policies, known as the power policies in WHO. They always say empower, but I don't think monitoring is a policy. So I always refer to these as power policies. So it's taxes, it's smoke-free, it's graphic warning labels, it's TAPS bans, and it's cessation support. So during the first decade of the treaty, from 2005 to 2015, there were countries that implemented 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 0 of those policies. Actually, NUI implemented -1 because they had a policy, FCTC policy, then they took it back. So that's why the axis there starts with -1 and not 0, weirdly. So then we looked at, on the y-axis, the outcome was the reduction in smoking prevalence from the WHO. These are 126 countries of the WHO data set. And you can see, of course, that there's a negative dose response effect. The greater the number of policies that were implemented at a high level, the greater the reduction in smoking prevalence. And these are huge effects. 1.57 percentage point decrease for each policy implemented. And because, of course, and it's a much greater relative decrease, 7% for each policy, FCTC policy implemented at the highest level in that 10-year period of time. So the FCTC works if these policies are implemented. But there is a problem, which is there was very poor implementation. So in our article, we also pointed out, and this had been pointed out by others, but the average country implemented only 1.04 of those 5 policies in the first decade. Incredible gap. So here's from WHO's one of the Empower reports there, and you can see this is for smoke-free and cessation and pack warnings, mass media, advertising bans, and taxation. This is the percentage of the world's population that is covered by those policies. And you can see the incredible gap there in the implementation. So this has led to a discussion of Endgame across different countries. What can we do to do more to reduce smoking? But as we develop Endgame measures and work toward implementation, the road ahead may seem impossible. But tobacco control measures of any kind were once thought to be impossible. Smoking cigars on planes, in bars, everywhere, accepting the norm that smoking was the typical thing, and that people who didn't want others to smoke were just not, they were infringing upon the rights of smokers. That was what the situation was like when smoking prevalence in a number of countries among men was 50, 60, 70%. So in that environment, trying to pass something like a smoke-free law or graphic warning labels or anything that was anti-tobacco was seen as impossible and actually wrong because of the prevailing norms. But we made, or not we, but the tobacco control community made the impossible possible. Consider the Canadian warnings prior to 1988. This was the warning on cigarette packs in Canada. And it says, oops, wait, where's the second there? Do you see that there? Avoid inhaling. That was advice given on packs. These are health warnings in Canada in 1988. Now, these are the warnings today in Canada. These are what, 12 of the 15 warnings there? Extraordinary difference between those. So the Canadian warning system indeed was just revised, and it's being implemented right now. It has 4 components. We have and this is what the whole package system looks like. And it's important to note that it's a system. It's not just the warnings. It's an information system that deals with different aspects of these deadly products and then tries to communicate different things depending on what component of the pack warning system. So we have the front and back pictorial warnings there on front and back. We also have the inserts, which Australia is going to be implementing. And these have been on the pack since 2012. And these are really quite extraordinary because they're passive information systems that are there to kind of remind people, the smokers, those who smoke, that they can quit. But that quitting may be hard. But here are some tips for dealing with that, how hard it is. So really, these are quit aids that are available when the person who smokes is ready to receive it, but it's always there. So there are a number of them. They've been revised there. It's really quite something. And then on the edges of the pack, you've got this new information, very vivid information about toxicity. And then finally, of course, the thing that gets all the attention is warnings on sticks. So Canada is the first country to have implemented these after they have been talked about for many years. So you put those 4 components together, and then you ask yourself, well, for a country that's done this, Article 11, what's left? I can't think of a thing. So Article 11 is done, dusted and done. You're going to have to revise the content, but I don't think there's any further that you can go on it. So how did the warning labels progress from avoid inhaling to an extraordinary information system? Well, I could talk for 5 hours on this, so I'll just give you, 20 seconds of it. It happened through a combination of all kinds of information from research, from advocacy, from government officials that were brave and courageous and were supported by the community, and a combination and a unique confluence of all of these coming together. And you find that anyone who's worked with policy and advocacy knows there's like a magic combination that may not in any country be predictable, but that when the opportunity arises, you have to take grab of it and then pull the resources and pull the communities together, the different sectors together to try to achieve it, strike while the iron is hot. So in Canada, there was at the time growing awareness of the harms of smoking, recognition that the existing warnings were not commensurate with the hazard, and persistent and dogged advocacy. And the person pictured there is Garfield Mahood, who was, he's now retired, a leading advocate, a global advocate in tobacco control. And I learned so much from working with Gar on this. And let me just tell you one thing that he told me when he was describing what he had done to put together the package for the graphic warning label proposal to Parliament. So he mocked up, it's the first one to mock up graphic warning labels, and he arranged them in nice, neat boxes so that you can kind of open the box like a cigar box, perhaps, and then see the warning labels all kind of there, all mocked up. And he told me that, first of all, he was really sensational in sort of, kind of the vivid communication. This was back in 30 years ago or so. And then he said that someone asked him, tell me, how come you think that these warnings are appropriate to be put on cigarette packs? And Gar said something, I want to pass it on to you because I use this all the time. He said, well, you tell me what warnings would be appropriate for a product that kills half of its regular users. So linking to the concept in regulatory law that the warning should be commensurate with the level of hazard. And he gave that. So you can feel free to use that because it could come up in your life. It's come up in my life many times. So there were a lot of creative campaigns during that time to educate politicians and the public about this problem. So the research demonstrated the need to do something and the extremity of the hazard. Then the warning labels were designed commensurate within bounds to meet that hazard. And then after implementation, ITC, mostly ITC, but other groups would have the opportunity to evaluate these. And that's exactly what we did in Australia. This is after graphic warning labels were introduced in 2006. Are indicators of warning effectiveness, salience, thinking about the health risks, thinking about quitting because of the warnings, actually putting out a cigarette you were about to smoke because of the warnings, avoiding the warnings, which is actually a sign, a good sign. So all of those indicators you can see in Australia went up after the introduction of graphic warning labels. And then because of wear out, they start coming down, which of course illustrates the need to refurbish and redesign and revise the warning labels over quite quickly, actually. And that happened also in New Zealand when they introduced graphic warning labels in 2008. And then in Kenya, the ITC project showed in our national cohort study, the same thing happened in that country. Having these multiple countries where the same thing happens, and the range of countries, from the high-income countries to the middle-income countries to the low-income countries, all finding the same thing, is very powerful evidence for governments that have not implemented the policy to see the generality of the impact of this policy that then allows them to say with confidence that it's going to happen in their country. And progression of pictorial warnings has been quite stunning. They're now in 138 countries covering 5.3 billion people. So comprehensive smoke-free laws. How did Ireland do it? Ireland, the land of the Irish pubs. When this was proposed to go smoke-free, they said it's going to destroy the culture of the Irish pubs. So how did they do it? Well, again, evidence emerging on the harms of secondhand smoke. Ireland and other countries began to restrict the smoking. What they did was they framed it, instead of smokers' rights, it's non-smokers' rights. And of course, we know that the evidence and the research on showing the hazards of secondhand smoke had that capability of taking it out of a libertarian sort of frame. It's okay if I kill myself. That's my choice. To people need to be protected because what one person is doing is harming others. So they framed it, however, in Ireland, they framed it because they realized they couldn't get too far if they just framed it in terms of consumer protection, because that would be kind of beating up on the smokers. So they were sort of intermediate with respect to how much we want to push there. Instead, we want to highlight the harms to other people that belong in those places, namely the employees in the pubs. So it wasn't about consumer protection, not about smoking reduction. It's a health and safety issue for employees. And there was a extraordinary amount of research done to sort of promote that kind of position. So here's James Rapace, who's a very famous environmental scientist. And he, I think this was 2002 or so, he did a study, and he had done a lot of studies on the harmfulness of secondhand smoke in Hong Kong and Boston and other places. He's actually quite a character. He said he estimated that approximately 150 bar workers a year in Ireland will die from ill health caused by environmental tobacco smoke. I don't know about the validity of that, but that's what James said at the time. He also said, in response to those who claimed that ventilation would work, they were selling these systems to restaurants, these elaborate systems that would suck up the air and so on. Well, James, being an environmental scientist, he knows how many atmosphere replacements you need in a certain amount of time to really clear the air. And he said ventilation cannot control tobacco smoke except at impossible tornado force wind speeds. The best ventilation or air cleaning system cannot capture the smoke, which reaches a worker's nose before it reaches the exhaust grill. Another critical piece of evidence was Shane Allwright's report. She was an environmental epidemiologist. She's now co-chancellor of TCD, Trinity College Dublin. She was also a part of our principal investigator on our ITC Ireland evaluation study. So she was charged with organizing a report to identify and report on the degree of consensus that exists among leading scientific authorities on the question of the hazard and risk posed by ETS to human health in the workplace. So there was also polling done on support for the proposed law, showing that the majority of the public in Ireland supported that proposal. And then Micheál Martin, who was health minister at the time, he also became prime minister, and now he's minister of external affairs or something for Ireland. He announced in January of 2003, he announced that he was going to go comprehensive smoke-free. And he said the following: "I'm doing this because, as this report makes inescapably clear, I have no choice. There's no moral option open to me other than to take action." And before this consensus was correlated and stated so bluntly, it was possible to temporize, to negotiate, to water down the measures I'd like to have taken, recognizing the political struggle of this. But this report changes everything. And so it went in March 29th, 2004, and we were there to evaluate it in a new cohort study, national cohort study in Ireland, compared to the control, a new cohort in the UK as a control. So we did this, and look at those results there. The reporting smoking in bars on the left there went from 97% to 5% in 1 year, from the ceiling to the floor. I will never have results like this in my lifetime. May I wish you well in seeking those kinds of effect sizes in your own research. But at the same time, you can see the support for total ban. This is among smokers, went up significantly in Ireland. And indeed, it kept going up and up and up. So it was like 85% by the time we stopped surveying there. So what I did, and ITC Project and others did, was to disseminate this quickly to other countries with this evidence showing the powerful impact of the Ireland smoke-free law. And I went to a high-level meeting in Luxembourg, and there were, I don't know, 10 health ministers from Europe there and others there, including Micheál Martin. So, and that contributed to, they never say what, why they did, because for politicians, oftentimes it's just their enlightenment rather than other sources. But you saw a number of European countries implement smoke-free laws shortly thereafter. So there were also, we've gone on to look at dose response effects. Here are the effects of smoking prevalence in restaurants in a number of countries where we had ITC cohort studies ongoing. In Ireland, on the left, it went from 84% to 2% in restaurants, 97 to 5 in bars, pubs, 84 to 2 in restaurants. Scotland, France, Germany, Netherlands, Mexico City, other cities in Mexico, Mauritius, Korea, Japan. I mean, this is a number of years ago, and then Beijing, that had done a comprehensive law, sort of, compared to the other cities above it, 6 other cities where they were all partial. You can see the dose response effect, which is very powerful, because then you can see, oh, if you go comprehensive, you will achieve the greatest good. And also we demonstrated, this is work that we did looking at France over a 5-year period of time. So it went down and it stayed down. We find that in virtually every country. So the progression of smoke-free laws, there was really rapid growth after a few leading jurisdictions implemented that policy. So Massachusetts, after the first town in Massachusetts banned smoking in 2003, 217 other towns in Massachusetts followed them within a year. And then soon, of course, it went beyond Massachusetts. Progression of smoke-free laws globally, now it's still not very good, but it's in 74 countries covering 2.1 billion people. And another example of something that people didn't really think was possible was, of course, the experience in Australia with plain packaging, with research evidence, with individual politicians, Nicola Roxon. And then when implemented, Mel did, and her team and colleagues evaluated it, and in that tobacco control special issues and dissemination spread to other countries. And we helped that spread there in our ITC reports across different countries, including New Zealand. And also helped in defending Australia's plain packaging at the WTO, successful after 6 years. And progression of plain packaging, it's now in 25 countries. But as I said before, demand reduction policies are not enough. If you think about warnings, as I said, with graphic warning labels in the system now in Canada, I really don't think you can do much more. After you do plain packaging, I don't know, how plainer can you get? Taxes, of course, Australia has been pushing the envelope with respect to that. There may be limits there. There may not be limits, noting, and I'm noting the Laffer curve on sort of optimal taxation. That is not really the limit. I think the limit is sort of political, not the actual impact of it, because quite frankly, I think there's a hell of a lot of room to raise the taxes well, beyond it, and still, get quite a bit of revenue. I don't think the society will stand for it. But you can push the envelope on that. So, but nonetheless, there's only so far you can go on that. And then smoke-free. If you've got a comprehensive smoke-free law and you're enforcing it well, you can't really do anything more. So the FCTC itself, for those high-achieving countries, need to seek out other opportunities to reduce commercial tobacco. And Coral had mentioned the distinction between the incremental kinds of measures, FCTC, and then the potentially disruptive ones here. And I won't go over this again because you know those. So, of course, tobacco endgame. We've already talked about this in Coral. And I've been involved in many, I think I've gone to like 6 international meetings starting in 2013 in Delhi on the tobacco endgame. Hong Kong and Canada, and then, more recently, the U.S. Endgame Summit. Actually, seems a lot longer than that, doesn't it? I won't comment on that, but there are people in this audience that don't like the fact that I take photos. I'm really sorry, but I feel like it's history, and we don't know we're living history when we're living it. It's only looking back. So anyway, in perpetuity, I'm sorry. So there are, new developments in the Endgame. Coral went over these, so I don't think I have to go over this here. But there is research that can be done to promote and to advance Endgame. A very important aspect of this is support for the Endgame policies here, and we have done that across many different countries, Canada, New Zealand, and of course, our Korean colleagues have looked through. Have also done this. Hyewon did a study on support for endgame policies in Korea. There's a meta-analysis that's is it submitted or it's going to be submitted? Anyway, so I kind of charted this support for reduced nicotine in different countries from different sources here. And hey, 50%, in 2010 in the US. And then the rest of the time, it's well above 50% there with respect to support for reduced nicotine there. Now, the level of support for smoke-free in Ireland was something like 13 or 17% before their ultimately successful policy there. These are considerably higher. Now, I grant you, there are differences in knowledge of the question when you're asked about not being able to smoke in a bar. You know what that would feel like, most likely. How you would feel about reducing nicotine in your cigarettes, that's certainly not the same level of knowledge going in. So I grant you the fact that there are going to be differences in sort of the validity and the projective, capability of these kinds of questions here. Nonetheless, with respect to a piece of evidence that is viable to communicate to policymakers about the fact that this thing that you are afraid of, there may be more support than you can imagine among those that would be put out by it or greatly affected by it. So that's important information. So the last thing I want to talk about, I'm going to go just a few minutes over, is to connect the tobacco endgame back to the FCTC. So this is what I had showed you about the importance of the FCTC in all of these global initiatives here. And in the second decade of the FCTC, they've created a strategic plan, the Global Strategy to Accelerate Tobacco Control, which is aimed at increasing, doing something about that implementation gap. But Article 2.1 has always been in the FCTC, and it basically says the following: parties are encouraged to implement measures beyond those required by this convention. Nothing in these instruments, the policies 6, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, et cetera, nothing in these instruments shall prevent a party from imposing stricter requirements. So in other words, the FCTC and its guidelines is a starting point, not an ending point. That's really critical because in the WTO challenge, one of the main things that PMI's sponsored countries were arguing was that you shouldn't go beyond the guidelines. And they said that in Uruguay as well. So it was really important. This sort of 2.1 is kind of like the elastic clause of the U.S. Constitution in some sense, that you want it as a starting point. It's kind of like a living, legal instrument, and that depending on the future, you can expand out. So it really opens the door to endgame here. And so at the last COP in Panama, the establishment of an expert group to look at measures that are forward-looking. And the report's going to be presented at the next COP, which is like a year and 4 months away or something, or 6 months away. So the FCTC in the broader picture, I conceive of it as the following. The first decade was growing the treaty, getting countries to ratify it, building the guidelines to provide more detail with respect to what the parties would be doing. In the second decade, implementing the treaty and creating the global strategy to facilitate that. Now, I think in the third decade, 2025 to 35, continuing the initiative to increase implementation and then also strengthening the treaty by advancing these forward-looking measures. So everything is kind of converging now on 2030. The alignment of the SDGs, which the target year is 2030, the WHO NCD action plan, which also has the target date of year of 2030. And then the global strategy at the last COP has now been extended to 2030. Everything's converging. And tobacco endgame measures and extending the scope and reach of the FCTC can be a huge part of that momentum carrying us forward to 2030. So finally, closing thoughts, the history of the fight against the #1 preventable cause of death and disease has much to offer as pathways to tobacco endgame considerations. And each of these battles, smoke-free, taxes, graphic warning labels, they've been waged with different weapons and on different battlefields across different countries. Each battle has involved a combination of a community of researchers, advocates, and governments, mostly working together in important ways. After many years in dedicated effort by researchers, government advocates, and other stakeholders, some tobacco endgame measures are beginning to take hold. But importantly, industry will push back with unprecedented force. They were really adamant against the graphic warning labels. They were adamant against smoke-free laws, especially, much more vehement than the graphic warning labels here. But now we're getting to the meat of things. We're getting to the very reason why many people smoke or continue to smoke and can't quit. De-nicking, reducing the nicotine levels in cigarettes. This is an existential threat to this industry. And it's going to be very important for everyone in this, everyone doing Endgame to recognize how extraordinarily vicious this is going to get. So let me just give you a concrete sense of what's at stake here. Credit Suisse did an analysis of 16 US industries from 1900 to 2010. And they asked the question, if you invested $1 in 1900, how much would your investment be worth in 2010? Years. So think about that, if you can, and think about the magic of compounding interest. And that's what you have. And so they did this, and the stock market, if you put $1 in 1900 and you cashed out somehow, 110 years later, that $1 would have earned 38,255. Not bad, right? But the leading industry of all of them was the tobacco industry. And guess how much that was? $6.28 million for every dollar in 1900. Now, this is a logarithmic scale. So we don't spend in logarithmic dollars. We spend in linear dollars. And so this is what it looks like. On the left is the stock market, and on the right is tobacco. And it occasioned Warren Buffett, before he found Bill Gates, to say this about the investment in cigarettes. I'll tell you why I like the cigarette business. It costs a penny to make, sell it for $1, it's addictive, and there's a fantastic brand loyalty. This is what the existential threat looks like. So we have to be prepared for that. So finally, there's an importance of making connections to broader initiatives, movements, and communities. And finally, the strategic plan of the FCTC has synergy with the tobacco endgame, where the strategic plan, global strategy to increase implementation will float all boats. And those that have already done so much in tobacco control can look to the forward-looking measures to take them beyond that. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions or discussions later, happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Roaming mics. So I'll just open the floor up to questions from the audience. No questions? Okay, well, Jeff, I've got a question then. So you were talking about, the island example and the sort of, I guess, arguments or framing that was used in terms of what evidence was convincing there, and that the consumer protection argument wasn't going to fly with the island ban. But we now have very comprehensive smoke-free laws in indoor public places in many locations like Ireland now and Australia. So what do you think the argument is now? Do you think consumer protection now comes into play, or is it still problematic?
Well, I think that in Ireland, they needed to make sure that the pub owners and the employees were given the kind of focus, because they knew that the resistance would be stronger potentially in that group, and because of all these arguments about pub culture. So they needed to frame the argument with respect to their key constituency that they had to win over. So I think that each country and each situation will have perhaps a different configuration of those constituencies that are most necessary to get on board. In other words, it's kind of like, you know, parliamentary politics. You form blocks and relationships with certain groups of MPs, let's say, on some issues because you really need them, and otherwise they're going to defeat you. So I think there's that kind of political sort of mapping and understanding of what kinds of groups you need to associate with. So that may differ. So I don't know if there's a historical you know, difference here. I think it really is based on what you think will work.
And what do you think would be the key piece of evidence that would convince a politician to implement a commercial tobacco endgame policy?
Well, I guess it depends on which one you're talking about, right? Because some of them will fit into what the government is already thinking about. It depends on the infrastructure that's present to achieve that. It depends on the ability to monitor and enforce, especially in those countries where illicit might be more of a problem than in others. So in each one of the endgame measures, there are potential sort of checklists of things that one needs to figure out before entering in and trying to achieve that. You know, it's interesting. I mean, you think about New Zealand, and you think about, of course, the challenge of what they were trying to achieve, doing all those things sort of semi-simultaneously, and the challenges of making sure, or trying to make sure, or convincing themselves that they have the infrastructure available to deal with what would happen. And I think that each country can learn from that, not necessarily what happened, the outcome, but rather the preparation that was necessary. You know, in the same way as you know, when it's easy to build buildings, but it's very difficult to maintain them. It's very easy to say, for example, in my country of Canada, that cannabis, oh, we'll just decrim it all and we'll just make it all legal, and without putting in the place, you know, in place the kinds of structures, infrastructure, and so on to make sure that it works. And I think that that kind of, you know, New Zealand has really led the way with respect to the kinds of considerations that they were undertaking for that. And I think that it serves as a sort of a general approach that all countries, all jurisdictions need to go through to try to achieve success.
Do you have any questions here? You have a microphone down. Oh, so Richard, and then up the back.
Oh, thanks for a wonderful talk, Jeff. I was just wondering if you think we're doing, and given that there is this existential threat and the industry is going to do everything to oppose these measures, as we've seen in New Zealand, do you think we're doing enough as a sort of community of people who are interested in endgames to support countries or maybe subnational jurisdictions and to monitor what's going on and say, when these things happen, we really need to get behind them and support them in every way? And are we doing that systematically? I mean, I know you do it, you're an exemplar of doing it, but are we doing it enough as a sort of international community interested? Is there more that we could do? And I'm maybe particularly thinking about, I mean, we had great support in New Zealand, but I'm thinking more maybe in low and middle income countries or small jurisdictions where these things are happening, and maybe we should be really getting behind them for all the support we can.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, what's so exciting is that the end game kind of concept. I'm always reminded in sort of tobacco and control policy, you know, that thing that they talk about, like in Hollywood. Yeah. It took 30 years to become an overnight success, right? That is so true of tobacco control policies, right? I mean, we're talking about graphic warning, advertising bans that were talked about 20 years before the first one was done. We're talking about, 1993 with respect to sort of denicking and so on. And now it's sort of kind of like getting to the point where it might actually be implemented someday. So there are investments there, and we need to take advantage of those communities wherever that are thinking about these and really support it. And it's so great because, I mean, this program, the CRE Endgame community now is the kind of community that can monitor what's going on in the world. Chris Bostic and Ash are doing that. Other kinds of groups are starting to join in now. I mean, I think now what CTF, Tobacco Free Kids, is going to sort of sign on and support in some ways. That. So with the kind of reach of it and the support that's necessary, I think that's really critical. Because if you get an actual implementation and you can evaluate it there, that it can, like the Massachusetts situation where a few cities do it, everyone's doing it. I mean, it's certainly not going to be the same way with respect to, VLNCs, like all of a sudden 100 countries are going to do it. But no, but the principle is the same. We need to support those that are out there in front. I mean, Australia is still reeling from plain packaging defense. But nonetheless, they were brave and they were courageous in it. And the rest of the world should be very thankful for Australia in that. And we should do the same for those before they have to spend so much money.
Yeah, hi, Kim Richter from KU Med Center in Kansas. Thanks for the wonderful talks from both of you. I guess I was wondering two things. Is there a move, sort of an international quality improvement movement to help people who have implemented different measures improve the quality of implementation? And the second question has to do with whether there are, historical precedents of very, very harmful behaviors or industries or practices that have been displaced or gone away that might be instructive for the tobacco endgame. Because I know a lot of people have felt that e-cigarettes have the potential to basically displace more harmful forms of tobacco use, but and where is that, number one? And also, are there historical precedents that we could be following?
Yeah, well, as far as sort of quality or improvement and so on, there are, there are the guidelines of the FCTC articles that provide the kinds of activities and measures within each policy domain. There's also quite a bit of technical support, especially in the traditional power measures now. We know a lot about tax, smoke-free, warning labels and so on. I mean, some of them don't need that much monitoring, like warning labels, right? Smoke-free can be very intensive. And in a number of countries we've studied, like the low and middle income countries, that they just don't have infrastructure for it. It's just very difficult. But there is technical assistance that's provided or given. Whether or not each country has the capacity to do all that, that's difficult. That certainly runs into trouble when you're thinking about product regulation, where whether it's contents or whether it's certain kinds of features on or menthol ban in our case, countries shy away from that because they just don't have the technical capability of that. So there isn't a single system of that, but there's the recognition of the problem and technical assistance for it. Whether or not the capacity exists is for that jurisdiction and country to try to figure out about that. Your other questions had to do with, the last one was about e-cigarettes. That's a huge question about substitution. I'll just simply say that there's evidence of partial substitution, whether or not among the ones that we study, which are the adult cohort, it's not clear, to what extent that is complete substitution and quitting. So that goes on. We also know that in our work with heated tobacco products in Japan and Korea, they are not quitting. They're actually transitioning to long-term dual use right now. Doesn't mean that's not going to change. And there might be some sort of supply push that's going to push them more. But right now, they're not quitting. And indeed, the tobacco companies are positioning that product along with the cigarettes that they make, along with the ONPs, along with the vaping products, as a system of, this is the product line. And they're pushing the idea of poly use across different situations in one's day. BAT and JTI are the ones that push that the most relative to PMI. So it's going to be a real issue with respect to whether the potential of harm reduction from a toxicological perspective of these products is actually borne out in the ways in which they use them in the real world, and real world behavior and how you use the products, whether you're a single user or a multiple user. That's out of the reach of regulatory and policy considerations. You can't regulate that, how people use the products. You can push on it. You can push one versus another, like differential taxation, but you can't push the combination together. And so it's not clear what's going to happen if you try to use these sorts of policies that have been trying to push things down, a single product down, and see whether or not that actually leads to switching itself. That's very unclear. So I think the whole issue is really up in the air right now.
Do you have any other questions in the audience? Oh, over there. On the left first. Oh, just, okay. I thought we'll go, and then Natalie will go to you afterwards. So we'll go closest.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm Jaeyoung from South Korea. And my question is, what the value or principle do you see in the priority for where the endgame policy can stand on, aligning with SDG especially, to counteract the enormous economic profit that we have seen in your slide?
Wow, there's a lot involved in what you were saying. I'm going to try to respond in ways that I think what you're trying to say, like how does it all come together? Like how does Endgame link to SDGs? Is that what you were trying to ask me? Yeah.
Actually, the point of the value or principle that Endgame policy can stand on, but as you said, we are heading to the goal of FCTC in a broad sense toward the alignment to the SDG. So that's why I wanted to ask, especially linked with the SDG goal, we can share globally.
Yeah, I mean, the SDGs talk about how one should implement the FCTC. There's an actual sub-goal, can't remember what number it is. But behind that is to achieve the overall goal of 30% reduction in NCD deaths or something by 2030, which they're not going to get. It's aspirational. So they say FCTC because structurally they want to refer to their, to the WHO's treaty because it's the UN. So they're staying within the bounds of what, has been passed by the international community. But it doesn't mean that alongside it, there can't be tobacco control policies that are consistent with it. So the link to the FCTC of Endgame is through 2.1. So the implementation of the FCTC is not really defined. And so if 2.1 gives you more, richer kinds of measures that can drive down smoking more quickly, then that's part of the FCTC that links to the SDGs, right? So that's how it's connected.
My question was around whether you think the tobacco endgame is going to morph into a nicotine endgame.
A what?
A nicotine endgame.
I think that's going to be a debate that we're going to have for many years. I don't have a prediction. I don't have a prediction because countries are dealing with this, and as you know, in very different ways. There's nicotine-free generation, and there's tobacco-free generation, and there's smoke-free generation, and all kinds of things. I think that at this point, I think whatever works for a particular country in their political context, I'd just like to see something happening there, and then we can sort it out. I mean, we'll never sort it out, but at least we will have some models of things that were actually done, and perhaps we can evaluate it and see how it worked. So I'm open to that because I tend not to be prescriptive. I want to see what countries do in their own contexts and then see what happens.
Any other questions? A burning question I can see.
Hi, Jeff. I'm just wondering, at the FCT level, is there much consideration of, for those countries that haven't been able to implement a lot of the demand reduction measures? You talked about the implementation strategy to support them and encourage that work, but is there consideration about just kind of leapfrogging them to endgame measures and to kind of bypassing a lot of that work and the time taken to implement and see that success?
Well, I actually think that there's something for everybody with the combination of global strategy, which says implement if you haven't implemented. And then there's something extra for those that have implemented. They can go with 2.1 to greater. So it's really providing a structural opportunity for all parties. Those that have not implemented yet, they can come up to a certain level. And it's kind of like if you were, I don't know, like you're trying to decide what class of athletic competition you're going to, go. And if you're a beginner, you go at a mild level. But for those that have gone on, they're at the expert level. So, but if you don't have these sorts of incentives along the spectrum of what what the world looks like, then you're going to leave people behind, parties behind. And this is actually kind of a structure. I don't know if people think of it this way. I think of it this way. There's something for everybody in that combination of the global strategy and then 2.1. So I think in general, it's going to re-engage the world and propelled forward by the linkage of those global initiatives to really pay more attention again, or keep the focus on the tragedy of tobacco use and tobacco harm.
So I've got another question about how we divide our research time, looking at new business as usual type of approaches and more novel approaches that have got maybe greater potential but are more difficult politically to implement. So are we spending too much time on the run-of-the-mill demand reduction strategies? Yeah, as you were showing with the Canadian packs, there's not really a lot more you can do with those now. I mean, other than maybe when you open it, it smells bad. I'm thinking dog feces or something, or it tells you, it says something to you, like a greeting card, tells you why are you smoking, stop, or something,
Yeah, I mean, you could combine it with AI or something. Or it could be like, what was that room in 1984, room 2 something? Huh? You remember and you went in there as like your worst fear, right? It's kind of like that.
We can do further with the packaging and so on, right? So
exactly. Yeah.
So when we go next, where's the next priority?
Well, so different priorities for different parties, right? Because there are a number of countries, and we're still working with these countries that haven't done those. So, we're pitching, we're submitting like in the next couple of days, a grant application to do this in, Malaysia and in Vietnam to to continue our ITC cohorts to identify the needs yet again for them, and then combine it in a systematic way with what we know, the policies that will work to fulfill those needs. So throughout the world, there's going to be different kinds of needs. We as researchers are going to have to choose depending on the countries we're working with, depending on, where we want to go with this. There's something for everybody. Now, to be sure, of course, the forward-looking kinds of measures, that's the kind of exciting part of it. But I really think it'd be far better to get smoke-free in China than to get tobacco-free generation in Singapore. What if you want to have global impact, you go to where there are a lot of people there. That's why we spent so much time in China, beating our heads against the wall there. But we tried because we thought we could do something there, and we almost did, but it just kind of broke down. So it just depends on the kind of ITC was always in the situation from the start where we were dealing with entire countries and multiple countries. So we could actually look more at the range of the high population. So my priorities are going to be different from yours or others in this room, but it all comes together. And I think it's quite exciting, the fact that there is there potential for those that haven't, focusing on the traditional measures as well as those that are forward-looking.
Excellent. Any last questions? Oh. Yeah, I can't see it. So, here we go. Sorry, I do see it. Okay. Yeah, so we've got a question from David Thomas online. Are there any risks for places with high prevalence and poor demand reduction implementation jumping to endgame policies, or is endgame only for others? Or should all be trying for endgame?
I don't have a clear answer to that. I think that there is a conceptual hierarchy, but I don't know if it's a necessarily logical one. So you can think of these as the legacy, measures, the power measures, and then, the new ones are the new ones. But there may be some opportunities to sort of jump the queue. And I don't really know what that looks like, but I can see where people would say, no, you must do all of these things and then you do something else. I don't necessarily think that that is correct, although politically and to communicate a strategy, that might seem like, something. So there may be a difference between a sort of a strategy for politics and convincing people to get on board, right? And those that would empirically actually lead to the greatest effect. I just don't know, but I do know there are political constraints, because people will say, you can't do this until you've done all those, and then you move on to the next stage. But then again, I come from psychology where, it was all about stage theories and, Piaget, and you had to be pre-operational and then concrete operational, and, and you had to go through those stages, and that's just, no, there's all sorts of décalage, blending of those, and people jump steps and so on. So I'm not really wedded to that, but I know politically there's a real strong orthodoxy with respect to, how policies should be done.
And I just would like to point out that I'm not actually suggesting that we make cigarette packs smell bad.
We'll coach you on that.
I can just see that being reported somewhere. Okay. Okay, so if we have no further questions, I'd like to thank Geoff for sharing his insights and experience over many years in different forms and the discussion this morning. Thanks very much.